The title of this segment is The Program and Practices of Early Akron AA. Compare the material in those verses in the book of Acts with what the early Akronites were described as doing. And there are 4 solid descriptions of it. Now, often people will phone me and say, we're forming a study group. What should we study? Actually, if people pull out the Bible and pull out the AA conference approved literature that I'm about to mention, they can study that. It's no big deal to study several verses from Acts and find out what the first century Christians were doing. And it's no big deal to study the 4 proofs that I'm going to mention and find out what the Akron people were doing. The point is, AA didn't know that and maybe still don't. So we suggest that you compare the material in the book of Acts. You can study that, discuss it, and then discuss these 4 solid descriptions. And I'm going to cover them with you. First, what the early Akron AA Christian Fellowship did of a nature similar to that of the apostles is attested in the personal testimonies of the Akron Christian Fellowship pioneers, 8 of which stories were published in the personal stories section of the first edition of AA's basic text, the Big Book, published in April 1939. Now here's the tragedy. The original AA Big Book contained the personal stories of the pioneers about what they did. So if you want to find out from their own lips what they did and compare it with the book of Acts, or simply get those ideas in your head, you'll see that they weren't trying to describe the book of Acts. They were describing how they got well, how they prayed to God, and so on. Now those personal stories, one by one, all but 3, were removed from the editions of AA's Big Book for years and years and years. And so when I came into AA in 1986, there was nothing to read by the pioneers except 3 stories. And even then, it wasn't that clear that they were pioneers. But the point is, where are the stories that tell you what the early AAs did and cause people like Bill Wilson and like AA number 3 to say, the Lord has cured us of this terrible disease, and we just want to keep talking about it and telling people. If you don't know what they were saying, they're not giving testimony. Bill screwed up in that he wrote his chapters of the Big Book describing steps, and we'll see most of them came from Oxford Group ideas, which happen to come from the Bible. But then he appended these pioneer stories, most of which were written before Bill's part of the Big Book, and were describing the Akron program. Now we've written a short book called Pioneer Stories in Alcoholics Anonymous. And in it, we excerpt those statements in which these pioneers tell you what they were doing that got them cured or well by the power of God. So that's the first testimony. Many churches have what are called testimonials. And the testimonials are where members get up and describe what God has done for them. The Oxford Group did the same thing. Well, the AAs did it, but what they said was removed. Finally, after the year 2000, these stories were restored by AA General Services offices But people are not about to buy that book because a lot of it is an apologetic statement. And they wrote their stories in the big book telling what God had done for them. But that isn't the only proof. Years later, there was an attestation by a 7-point summary of their program as of late February 1938, reported by Rockefeller agent Frank Amos and published in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers at page 131. So in conference-approved literature, the actual program of the Akronites, which was said to resemble first-century Christian fellowship, is laid out specifically and simply on page 131 of conference-approved literature, Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers at page 131, and Ken will read those 7 points.
As my dad mentioned, following his visit to Akron in February 1938, Frank Amos, John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s agent, summarized the original Akron AA program in 7 points. Here are those points as quoted on page 131 of the AA General Service Conference-approved book, Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. And on page 131 they are numbered 1 through 7. Number 1, an alcoholic must realize that he is an alcoholic, incurable from a medical viewpoint, and that he must never drink anything with alcohol in it. 2, he must surrender himself absolutely to God, realizing that in himself there is no hope. 3, not only must he want to stop drinking permanently, he must remove from his life other sins such as hatred, adultery, and others which frequently accompany alcoholism. Unless he will do this absolutely, Smith and his associates refuse to work with him. 4, he must have devotions every morning, a quiet time of prayer and some reading from the Bible and other religious literature. Unless this is faithfully followed, there is grave danger of backsliding. 5, he must be willing to help other alcoholics get straightened out. This throws up a protective barrier and strengthens his own willpower and convictions. 6, it is important, but not vital, that he meet frequently with other reformed alcoholics and form both a social and a religious comradeship. 7, important but not vital that he attend some religious service at least once weekly. And now I'll turn it back to my dad.
If I had the opportunity to simply redo over and over and over and over again in AA meetings around the United States, this segment that Ken and I are discussing would be it, because we're continually saying you can read conference-approved literature, that's stuff that's published today by AA, and an AA which has Christians, Roman Catholics, Jews, Protestants, Muslims, unbelievers, atheists, just about any variety of person who's a drunk in it. And those people would hear this, and here's what wouldn't happen. One of my sponsees, a young lady who had 5 years of sobriety, went to my Sunday night home meeting in Maui, and she came down to the meeting, and she was the speaker, and she told what God had done for her. And she said, this is what they did in early Akron AA. So after she walked past somebody, he said, that's baloney. They left Akron behind in 1935. And she came to me in tears and she said, "What do you do when somebody does that?" And I said, "You read on pamphlet P53, where Dr. Bob said we believe the answers to our problem were in the good book." And we read the book of James, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and 1 Corinthians 13. So the next time we go to that meeting, you read it to that old buzzard and see what he says. So she did. And he didn't say a word. And I haven't seen him in AA since. And he had about 9 years of sobriety. He couldn't take the facts that Dr. Bob was telling at a major AA conference not long before he died. So we're at the part which put AA on the map. There wouldn't be any AA if it hadn't been a success between 1935 and the spring of 1939. And what I'm describing to you through Ken and the Big Book and so forth is the things that they did, which resembled what the apostles did in the first century. And I'm giving you 4 illustrations, eyewitness accounts. And the first one is the personal testimonies of some 18 personal stories published in the first edition of the Big Book and removed. And you can see those stories today. AA has suddenly, after all this time, come out with an anniversary edition of the first edition of the Big Book. So years and years and years later, AAs will be able to buy from their own organization the first edition of the Big Book. But you know something? When you're an AA in California, I don't know about Maui, I don't know that I've heard it, they say don't read the stories in the back of the Big Book. The program of recovery is in the first 164 pages. And so many of the people that I hung out with in Marin County when I was new would tear out all the personal stories in the back of their Big Book. So they're not going to know this, whether they're tearing out first edition or fourth edition stories. But that's the first proof. The personal stories of the pioneers telling what they did and what God had accomplished for them in their lives. And they mention reading the Bible and reading the Runner's Bible in the upper room and so forth. The second thing is that Bill Wilson went back east to the Rockefellers and he wanted money. And the Rockefellers were not so stupid as to dish out the money without finding out what it was that Wilson was talking about. So they sent Frank Amos, who was an agent of the Rockefellers, to Akron to investigate. And he did. For about a week, he interviewed mothers and grandmas and husbands and doctors and judges to find out whether the people in Akron were successful and what they did. And then he rendered the report. There were 2 reports, but Ken's is critical. The 7 simple points that they did, which put them on the map and cured them. But there's more. This fact is attested by the following published remarks of Frank Amos in 1938, found on pages 135 to 36 of AA Conference Approved Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. And Frank Amos wrote, of the 110 members then in the program, 70 were in the Akron-Cleveland area. In many respects, their meetings have taken on the form of the meetings described in the Gospels of the early Christians during the first century. That's why we read you those segments from the book of Acts. But there's more. When the alcoholics gathered in the quarters of the Rockefellers in New York, there were several Rockefellers there, and old John D. was sick, so he didn't attend. and his son Nelson, who may or may not then have been the governor of New York, didn't attend then, but both men said the same thing later. And the voice that spoke for them was Mr. Albert Scott, chairman of the trustees for Riverside Church in New York. And he made the following comments after hearing the accounts of the AA founding group. And he described, as explained in page 148 of Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age, an excellent history, conference approved. And here's what he said after he heard the account. Why, this is first century Christianity. Now, he was chairman of the trustees for the Riverside Church in New York. And then, still more to the point, he added, what can we do to help? That's it. After almost 4 years of experience, the AAs took their case to the Rockefeller people, and at that time they described what you heard in terms of stories, in terms of Amos's summary, in terms of his conclusion that their stories were their meetings had taken on the form of the meetings described in the Gospels. So if you want to study about early AA, study those brief portions from the book of Acts, study those 7 points, and notice who said what. And that is Albert Scott and 4 other Rockefeller people to the same effect said, why, this is first century Christianity. Now, I'm going to cover with you briefly, but I said the part that we just covered is critical. When we talk about old school AA, we're talking about what those pioneers said, what Frank Amos reported, the fact that their meetings took on the form of the Gospels of the early Christians in the first century, and that no less a person than the chairman of the trustees of the Riverside Church said, why, this is first century Christianity.